We're continuing our look here now at the Emmanuel passage here in the book of Isaiah. And we introduced the book of Emmanuel, Isaiah 7 through 12. And we noted that the theme of a future child to be born, a significant individual who would be a ruler of the nation, is found throughout this section of Isaiah, not just in a single verse. And we noted that the child of chapter 9, for a child will be born to us, a son will be given to us, and the government will rest on his shoulders. He's called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. This is a child that Isaiah promises, and I believe this can only be fulfilled in Christ as we look at the specific language of it. And then in chapter 11 we noted that the shoot would come from the stem of Jesse, and that someday that the nations would resort to the root of Jesse. And so these are promises of a future David, the new David who would come and would result with the conversion of the nations and would result in a reign of righteousness and peace. And so we cannot just simply look at the verse in isolation and conclude one way or the other. If we come back to the language of Isaiah chapter 7, let's note a couple things in review. I suggested that the sign given to Ahaz is not really a sign for his benefit. In fact, the you there is plural in verse 14. The Lord will give you a sign. And so Ahaz has forfeited his opportunity for a sign that would bring about the immediate deliverance from his circumstances. Instead, we're told in verse 17, the Lord will bring on you, on your people, and on your father's house, such days as have never come since the day that Ephraim separated from Judah, the king of Assyria. So the king of Assyria is coming. This is going to be the worst nightmare, the worst thing that's happened to the nation of Israel since they divided, since Israel and Judah split back in 930 BC. After the reign of Solomon, his son Rehoboam followed foolish advice from his advisors and decided to raise the taxes and make the burden upon the people even greater. And so the northern tribes, the 10 northern tribes, divided, split off of Judah. And so 930, 10 of the 12 tribes now have become a competing separate nation, and Judah is left along with Benjamin. And Isaiah says this is the worst thing that's happened to the people of God since that time. It goes on to say in verse 18, it will come about in that day, when the king of Assyria comes, that the Lord will whistle for the fly that is in the remotest part of the rivers of Egypt, and for the bee that is in the land of Assyria, and they will come and settle on the steep ravines, on the ledges of the cliffs, on the thorn bushes, and all the watering places. So this is an invasion of bees, these bees and flies, not literal, but figurative of these nations that are going to create such devastation in the land. Another image in verse 20, in that day the Lord will shave with a razor, hired from regions beyond the Euphrates, that is, with the king of Assyria, the head, the hair of the legs, and will also remove the beard. And so God is going to shave His people from top to bottom. And He's going to do that with a hired razor. You know, we talk about in the Wild West, hired gun. Well, here, this is a hired razor, and the Lord God has hired the king of Assyria to do His bidding. Now, this theme in Old Testament prophecy of God using nations to punish His own nation is a theme that we encounter a number of times. If we just turn over to chapter 10 for a moment, chapter 10, verse 5, a condemnation against Assyria, but note the context of it. Woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger, and the staff in whose hands is my indignation. You see, God is using Assyria as His rod of anger, as His means of punishing His own people. In fact, in verse 6, I send it against a godless nation. Their God is talking about His own people. And commission it against the people of my fury. Once again, He's speaking of his own people. God, because of his wrath on his own nation, has employed the Assyrians to bring about the destruction of his people. He is going to punish his people through these pagan rulers. Now, you can go to the book of Habakkuk in the first chapter there and see how that theme is developed later with reference to the Babylonians. Later on in the days of Jeremiah and King Josiah, the prophet Habakkuk complains about the wickedness of Judah, and God then says he's going to send the Babylonians to do his punishment upon the nation, at which point Habakkuk recoils in horror. How could God use a nation more wicked than his own? And that's a similar theme that we have here in the book of Isaiah, where Isaiah says that Assyria is the instrument through which God is going to mete out punishment for his people. And so we have some really interesting language here in chapter 7. The fly, the bee, the razor that shaves the hairs of his people. And as a result of that, the land is going to be devastated. And we really can't go into all the details exegetically of what's happening here. But in verses 21 through 25, it looks like there is a loss of their agricultural system, a loss of population, not able to till the fields. Some of the land is reclaimed by wild animals, and land that used to be fertile cropland now becomes land for grazing of animals. And that's going to happen because of this failed policy of Ahaz, because Ahaz refused to have faith in God and refused to withstand the temptation to appeal to Assyria. God is now going to give Ahaz what he wants. The king of Assyria is coming, but it's not going to be as a blessing for the nation of Judah. It's going to be for a curse, and it's going to bring about the destruction of both the kingdom of Syria and the nation of Israel. Now, that language of the devastation is also described in chapter 8 as it refers to this promise involving Maher-shalal-Hashbaz. Remember, that was a negative name, talking about the way that the Assyrian army is going to hasten to the spoils of war. There's another interesting metaphor or contrast made here in chapter 8 in reference to the fact that because God's people have failed to embrace him and to choose him, he is going to give them what they deserve. There in verse 6, inasmuch as these people have rejected the gently flowing waters of Shiloach. Now, Shiloach was the stream there, a water channel that flowed next to the city of Jerusalem and eventually was diverted to flow into Jerusalem. And in the New Testament, the name Shiloach becomes Siloam, the pool of Siloam there in the Gospels. Well, this was a gently flowing stream. It represents God in this image. But God's people have refused that source of water. And so, since they've refused the waters of Shiloach, God is going to dump on them the waters of the Euphrates. Therefore, behold, the Lord is about to bring on them the strong and abundant waters of the Euphrates. Now, the Hebrew word, sometimes in the Old Testament, for the Euphrates River is just the Hebrew word Nahar, Ha-Nahar, the river. The Euphrates was such an important part of the landscape in the ancient Near East that it's simply called the river. So God's people refuse the gentle Shiloach River. God is going to dump on them the powerful, strong, overflowing, flooding Euphrates, even the king of Assyria and all his glory. So the Shiloach stream is a metaphor for God, and the Euphrates River is a metaphor for Assyria, or the king of Assyria. And it will rise up over all its channels and go over all its banks and sweep on into Judah and reach even to the neck. So this Assyrian flood is going to go to the very neck of Judah. It's not going to overwhelm Judah, but it's going to come very close to that. And that's being described here now in chapter 8. Coming back to the question before we look at some of the more of the literary features of this Emmanuel section of Isaiah, How is it that I can argue that Emmanuel refers to a future child when in fact the time frame of the childhood seems to be tied to the events in Ahaz's day? Let me come back to what I said. I think that we have the child in chapter 9, a future child mentioned. We have a future descendant of Jesse who is going to rule in chapter 11. I would also point out the book of Micah. Now, Micah is significant because he is contemporary with Isaiah. There are parallel passages in the books of Micah and Isaiah. And so in Isaiah chapter 5, when we read the Bethlehem prophecy, which is also cited in Matthew 2, really right next to the Emmanuel text there in Matthew chapter 1, verse 22. Micah 5:2, "But as for you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you one will go forth for me to be ruler in Israel. His goings forth are from long ago, from the days of eternity. Therefore he will give them up." The nation is going to be basically given up until the time when she who is in labor has borne a child. And then the remainder of his brethren will return to the sons of Israel. And he will arise and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, and in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God. Well, again, Micah is speaking here about an unusual birth. Why use this language, she who is in labor has borne a child? There must be something unique and special about the birth of this child. And again, this is not Hezekiah. This is not some immediate individual to be born, to be ruler, but rather this speaks of a unique birth. And some of the language here, his goings forth are from long ago, I think speak to the divine or supernatural nature of this child that is born to the woman. And so there's another parallel text to our Isaiah 7:14. Here's the way that I understand the time frame. And if one does not accept this argumentation, then I think one is left with the notion of some type of a dual fulfillment or an immediate fulfillment that typologically serves to represent a future fulfillment in Christ. My argument would be this, that the childhood described both in chapter 7 and chapter 8 is a typical childhood. So that phrase, before the boy knows enough to refuse evil and choose good, and the phrase there in chapter 8, before the boy knows how to cry out, "My father," or "My mother." In Hebrew, that might be Avi and Imi. So before the child can speak coherently, these nations that are threatening Judah are going to suffer demise. I would suggest that it doesn't really matter precisely when the child is born, so much as that the childhood period is a typical childhood period. In other words, that the Messiah could be born at that time or in 100 years or in 1,000 years, but the time frame of that childhood, of knowing good from evil, knowing how to say father, mother, that childhood is a limited period, a well-recognized period of time. And in that recognized period of time, that's how much time the nation of Syria has before it's going to be judged by God and before the Assyrians come. Now, given that interpretation, it's not critical that they're able to identify who the child is. It's not so much, well, where is the child and who is the child and when is the child born, as much as here is a typical childhood, and the notion is that this childhood time period is very short, and that's how much time that the enemies of Judah have. So I would argue that this could be a Messianic prophecy in Isaiah 7:14, and the childhood period mentioned there is a typical childhood and would apply to virtually any child, and it would be a well-known period of time. They're not waiting to find out when this particular child is able to know good from evil. They're not waiting for the child to be able to speak coherently, specifically. That's a general time frame that, for us, we could go to the books on pediatrics and child rearing, and we can tell what certain ages children will do certain things. And so, to me, it's a typical time frame, not specifically tied to a particular chronology. And so I would argue that the childhood of the Messiah, even though he may be born centuries later, could function as a time prophecy for the immediate events. And again, the events are not events of deliverance and hope for Ahaz, rather they represent the destruction. This is a judgment upon the nation that the childhood of the Messiah represents. Well, I want to say a word about some of the transitions, just to simply show how the immediate threat of Assyria and the future hope of the Messiah are tied together in this section called the Book of Emmanuel. If we go to the end of chapter 8, we are left with images of doom, gloom. It says in verse 22, "They looked to the earth, and behold, distress and darkness, gloom of anguish, driven away into darkness." But then note the transition. And remember, these chapter divisions are not original, and so the transition would be even more obvious without them. "But there will be no more gloom for her who was in anguish." So now we have a transition to a time of hope. In earlier times, he treated the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali with contempt. But later on, he shall make it glorious by way of the sea, on the other side of the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. Excuse me. Matthew 4 cites this text as applied to Christ. Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6, "For a child will be born to us." And so the gloom and doom of Assyria breaks forth in light, and now we see the reign of a future ruler who is going to bring blessing and peace to the people of God. We see a further transition going from chapter 10 to chapter 11. Now, I need to pause for a moment and introduce another historical event, another important area, and that is the nature of the Assyrian threat against Judah and the miracle that God performed in connection with that. We read about this in the book of Isaiah in a number of passages. Chapter 30, here at chapter 10 specifically, language that probably escapes us unless we understand what is going on. In 701 BC, the Assyrians, under Sennacherib, invade the remaining country of Judah. We're told that he captures basically all of the fortified cities of Judah. In his own records, Sennacherib refers to 46 walled cities. He speaks about taking captive some 200,000 of the Jews into captivity. Now, 701 BC, in the broader picture, was not a very good year for Judah. However, Jerusalem was spared destruction, not because of the wisdom of Hezekiah, even though he built a tunnel so that he could get a water supply, even though he did refortifications and supplied his armaments. Hezekiah did a lot of things to get ready for what he knew would be an invasion after he chose to withhold tribute from Assyria. But God condemns that kind of planning when, in fact, he didn't seek the Lord as fully as he should have, didn't depend upon God enough. And so in chapter 10, we have a description of this Assyrian invasion. For example, if we drop down in chapter 10 in verses 28 through 32, you see a whole list of names of towns. These are towns that the Assyrian army basically is passing through on its way to Jerusalem. Aiath and Migron and Michmash and Geba and Ramah and Gibeah and Laisha and Madmenah, various towns. And then it comes to verse 32. "Yet today he will halt at Nob, on the outskirts of Jerusalem, and shake his fist at the mountain of the daughter of Zion, the hill of Jerusalem." So the Assyrian army gets to Jerusalem, shakes its fist at Jerusalem, but does not conquer Jerusalem. Now, in the Assyrian records, Sennacherib himself talks about King Hezekiah. And in the Assyrian records, Hezekiah is referred to as boastful and proud and arrogant. He was one king that Sennacherib really wanted to take out. And he even uses this very famous line. He says, I had Hezekiah shut up like a bird in a cage. And then we went home. The bird got away. Jerusalem, the great prize of the campaign, escaped Sennacherib. Now, why is that? What happened that enabled Jerusalem to survive? Well, the account is given here later on in the book of Isaiah, historically back in chapters 36 and 37. Also, we find parallels in 2 Kings, starting there in 2 Kings chapter 18. We'll not turn to all of those, except just to note that God, because of the faithful prayers and repentance of Hezekiah, because of the intercession of Isaiah, this godly king brought about a change. And in Isaiah 37:36, it says, Then the angel of the Lord went out and struck 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. And the next morning, when everybody got up, behold, they were dead bodies. And Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and returned home. Well, the Bible tells us, records this remarkable deliverance of Jerusalem from the clutches of the Assyrian army. Now, there is an independent, indirect corroboration of this in the Greek historian Herodotus, who in his travels in the 5th century BC interviewed a number of Egyptian historians, priests, religious leaders, and they told a similar account of a deliverance from the Assyrian army at this very time in history. And so this invasion of Sennacherib, all we can say that something rather unusual and dramatic happened. And so you can't prove such a miracle archaeologically, but I think it's interesting to note that what Sennacherib thought would happen did not happen. And Herodotus tells us an Egyptian version of this. Egypt was involved in this invasion. Egypt came along the way to help against the Assyrians. Did not get the job done. But so 701 BC, the miraculous deliverance of Jerusalem. Now, as a result of that, one negative that came out of this was a belief, a false belief, that since this happened in the days of Hezekiah, that God would never allow His holy city and His temple to be destroyed. And so what some call the doctrine of the inviolability of Jerusalem came about. They got the wrong lesson out of this. The lesson was that Hezekiah's repentance and faithfulness and turning to God enabled God to forgive the nation and caused God to act on their behalf. The Jews just left it at, well, God will never allow the city to be destroyed no matter what. It's also called 701 theology, this notion that as long as we're there at the temple, inside the walls of the city, we are protected. There is a sermon in Jeremiah chapter 7 called the Temple Sermon, where he mocks them and quotes them, saying, you say the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. That's not going to get it done, he says. You're going to have to prove a relationship with God. You're going to have to act justly and righteously. You're going to have to take care of the widows and the orphans. You're going to have to practice ethics and social justice. And you're going to have to keep the Sabbath day. And if you do those things, then God will be with you as you claim He is. But you cannot simply trust on the temple and trust on the city as your refuge. But in the book of Isaiah, we see recorded this miraculous deliverance of Judah from the hands of the Assyrians. Now, it's described in different ways. Take a look at verse 26 in chapter 10. The Lord of hosts will arouse a scourge against him, against Assyria, like the slaughter of Midian at the rock of Oreb, going back to the days of Gideon. And then at the conclusion of chapter 10, and this transitions into 11, I want to show you how that works. 10:33, Behold, the Lord, the God of hosts, will lop off the boughs with a terrible crash. Those who are tall in stature will be cut down, and those who are lofty will be abased. And he will cut down the thickets of the forest with an iron axe, and Lebanon will fall by the mighty one. Go back to verses 15 and 16. Assyria is boasting about its power, and God asks the question, is the axe to boast itself over the one who chops with it? Is the saw to exalt itself over the one who wields it? That would be like a club wielding those who lift it, or a rod lifting him who is not wood. And so, who's really the important thing here? Is it the club, or is it the one wielding the club? Therefore, this is 10:16, the Lord, the God of hosts, will send a wasting disease among his stout warriors, the Assyrian army. And under his glory a fire will be kindled like a burning flame. And the light of Israel will become a fire, and his Holy One a flame. And it will burn and devour his thorns and briars in a single day. This single day is this destruction of the Assyrian army. It's described as a flame. It's described as cutting down the forest. The Lebanon forest was symbolic of power and might. And so the mighty Lebanon forest is going to be felled by the axe of God. Now, I pointed out between chapters 8 and 9 the transition from the immediate Assyrian circumstances to the future coming of the Messiah. Note the transition out of chapter 10 to chapter 11. And again, the chapter divisions here are somewhat artificial and certainly secondary. Talks about God, the mighty one, chopping down the mighty trees of Lebanon. And then transitioning in chapter 11, verse 1, then a shoot will spring from the stem of Jesse. So you go from this image of this forest being chopped down, demolished, to this stump, the stem of Jesse, that now has a sprout, a shoot coming up from it that bears fruit. And so I think there's a literary connection between, again, the felling of the Assyrian army and now the future Messianic hope. I would suggest that 701 BC, in a sense, is a foretaste of the future Messianic deliverance. God's people see in a visible way the power of God and how the promises of God can be fulfilled. And so in the midst of this gloom and doom, 701 BC, at least for the city of Jerusalem, functions as a reminder that God is a God who can do the impossible and that He does care for His people. Well, we talked about the transition. Let's just say a word or two now about chapter 11, and then we'll have to conclude our discussion of this book of Emmanuel. In chapter 11, the new David is described in several ways. First of all, in verses 1, it says that he administers messianic judgment or justice. And we read the verses there already. He will delight in the fear of the Lord, verse 3. Verse 4, he will judge the poor with righteousness. He will slay the wicked with the breath of his mouth, it says. And then in verses 6 through 9, we have what I would call here messianic peace. And the wolf will dwell with the lamb, and the leopard will lie down with the kid, and the calf and the young lamb and the fatling together, and a little boy will lead them. Now, some want to take this kind of language literally, and you certainly see pictures sometimes of the millennium where you've got the wild animals, mixing it up with the sheep and the cows. I would just say that this imagery of the lamb and the wolf and the leopard and so forth dwelling together goes back in ancient times, in the ancient Near East. This was a Sumerian language, Babylonian language. There are ancient texts and myths that use this type of language. And so the book of Isaiah, I think, is drawing from a lot of some metaphors that already exist and that are well known. Then there is the Messianic invitation, verse 10, that the nations are going to be drawn to this root of Jesse, who stands as a signal or a standard for the peoples. Armies would have standards, and by seeing those standards, they knew certain maneuvers to make, and people would be drawn to the standard. The day will come when the standard, who is the root of Jesse, will draw all nations to himself. And then the theme of Messianic reunification, which we talked about in our discussion of the book of Hosea. In verses 12 and 13, it talks about the banished ones of Israel and the dispersed ones of Judah being gathered. And then in verse 13, the jealousy of Ephraim will depart, and those who harass Judah will be cut off. Ephraim will not be jealous of Judah. Judah will not harass Ephraim. And together they will swoop down on the slopes of the Philistines on the west. Together they will plunder the sons of the east. They will possess Moab, Edom, and the sons of Ammon will be subject to them. Two themes here. One is the reunification of Israel and Judah, or Ephraim and Judah. We saw that in our discussion of the promises there in Hosea. Also, we will see it in connection with the promises of the new David, particularly in the book of Ezekiel. This reunited nation is going to conquer the area nations, the surrounding nations, the Edomites, the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Philistines. Now, how do we explain that language? Is this literal? Well, first of all, I've not seen the Moab soccer team competing in the World Cup. I don't know where those Ammonites are, and I certainly haven't come across a Philistine. It seems to me that this is the language of the type referring to the antitype. Here's the principle. Since David functions as a type of Christ, and David did certain things. In fact, if you go through reading in 2 Samuel, you'll see that David conquers the Ammonites. He conquers the Moabites and the Edomites. Of course, you're familiar with his conquest with the Philistines. And so, the career of the new David, or the Messiah, is described in terms of what the old David did. And so the new David does David-like things. This, therefore, is a spiritual conquest. This is the conversion of the Gentiles, described in military terms. This does not refer to a military campaign. And so I refer to this as the Messianic conquest. We see parallels of that language as well elsewhere. Isaiah 55 we'll talk about later, where Israel is going to be a tent that's going to increase and spread out and possess other nations under its cover. And then finally, the Messianic Exodus, just like God delivered them crossing the Red Sea from Egypt. It says in verse 16, there will be a highway from Assyria and the remnant of his people who will be left, just like in the days when they came out of the land of Egypt. This image of a highway we see in reference to the prophecies about John the Baptist, quoting from Isaiah 40. The highway means access. The mountains are going to be elevated or minimized, and the valleys are going to be exalted. And through this Messianic conquest now, and through this exodus, this new exodus of God's people, I think these are all Old Testament metaphors and images that describe the future hope of Israel. And so I'd like us then just to conclude now, reiterating the fact that I think Isaiah 7:14 can be viewed as a strictly Messianic prophecy. I realize there's discussion about that. And I think as a follow-up, we'll then turn next to Matthew chapter 2, and we'll discuss how the Gospel of Matthew utilizes some of these Messianic prophecies.